Hello and welcome to another podcast from Agile Technology. Today we're honored to be joined by Ralph Hughes. Hello, Ralph.
Hi there, Steve. How are you doing?
I'm very well and thank you for joining us today. Ralph, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking to the audience, or telling the audience, I'm sorry, about your background, your professional background, and how you ended up where you are today, please.
Sure, no problem. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I listened to your podcast, and it's really fantastic and so great to give exposure to these really interesting companies. And I'm honoured to join this list of this illustrious list. So I started out doing biomedical sciences at Newcastle, and then went on to do a bit of lobbying at the European Commission. Then did a master's in health economics and spent a bit of time doing health economics for the UK payer, which is nice. I then joined Pfizer, spent some time working at different levels of the organization, from the local level and submitting to NICE all the way up to global function, working on the pipeline. I then worked for Mundi Pharma, where I was heading up the market access capability, and then developed and then also was a commercial director launching a phase 3 asset. Recently, in the last year, joined PharmaVentures, where I head up our kind of pricing and market access capability, and we are trying to get people to start thinking about pricing and market access earlier in the development pathway.
So the company you're with now that you've joined, tell me a little bit about what they do.
Sure. So PharmaVentures is a transaction advisory firm, I think is probably the quickest way of describing it. So when you have, small biotechs, for example, who want to be bought by large pharmaceutical companies or want to out-license or partner their IP to a pharmaceutical company, we help them do that. So often they don't have the BD capability, the network, and so on to achieve that. So that's the kind of core functionality. But what that also does is it gives us great exposure to a lot of small biotechs. And so we also support them with elements that sit around that transactional process, things like valuation, things like benchmarking, but also importantly, pricing and market access. So in evaluation, there are lots of important things, but two really important factors are: what's the market share that your asset is going to achieve, and the other is price. And that is what really drives the kind of the sales and the peak sales forecast. So obviously price is very important, and so we help a lot of these kind of smaller companies with trying to think that through, because they don't have the internal capability, and that stuff is becoming really, really important. We also act on behalf of large companies as well. So if they want to go out and find smaller assets, they will employ us to go and see what's out there in the market that might fit their strategy. Say they're looking for a Parkinson's drug, we will go out and find all the Parkinson's drugs and tell them which ones are the best acquisition targets, and then help them kind of negotiate that deal as well.
So as a lead on from that, what is partnering and licensing in your industry?
Sure. So partnering and licensing. So there are various different ways. So in the old days, a drug company, think of one of the big ones, would have a bank of scientists with pipettes all day long, inventing drugs, and then they would patent maybe 1,000 drugs, one of which would make it to the market through all the regulatory processes and so on. That still happens, but on a much smaller scale. And actually what really happens now is that a university or some sort of research institution will develop some technology, they'll patent that technology, or they'll out-license, they'll spin out to a smaller company, or they will license directly to a pharmaceutical company. And that's kind of how that very early development process happens. And that can happen, that transfer of the IP from the developing organization, whether that's the research institute or the spin-out company, to the large pharmaceutical company, the I suppose marketing company, that will happen, or development marketing company, that will happen. That transfer of IP will happen either through a license agreement. They will co-develop it, so that's kind of what we often call partnering. So they'll develop the IP together, or they'll just straight out buy it. So that's a sort of M&A, mergers and acquisitions type deal.
So who are the key stakeholders in this?
So in that arrangement, you'll have, we'll take an example, you'll have a small biotech that will be the kind of key scientists who develop the asset. You'll have the kind of CEO and they all represent the kind of selling company. And then on the other side, you've got the large pharma company, and there you've got the R&D people, the BD people, the commercial people, and depending on the stage of the asset. So if the asset's in early discovery, then really it's the R&D people. When it's in phase 1 or phase 2, then at that point you're really talking about the commercial people. And I mean, obviously the technology has to hold together, but the commercial people deciding on whether this is going to be, what the forecast looks like. And that's the sort of point when pricing and access becomes really, really important.
But why is market access and pricing important in this process, in the early stage?
Well, as I mentioned before, when developing a forecast for an asset, so trying to understand the commercial potential of an asset, it's first of all understanding are the clinicians going to prescribe a drug, and therefore is it going to gain any kind of market share? And if it is, then great. But more and more, and I don't need to tell you this, Steve, but more and more, the payers are the gateways to the gateway to the market. So thinking ahead of time about whether your asset is going to get market access or whether it's going to gain payer approval at a certain price is vitally important. So that will control certain elements of market share. So will it gain access? That's a question of what percentage of the market will it gain access to, and the other is what price will it gain access to that market. And if the price is high enough, then you can drive profitability. If it's not high enough, well then you run into trouble. And to answer the other part of your question, which is why is it important early? Well, when we design our clinical trials, often we design them with the regulators in mind. So we think about the FDA, we think about the EMA, and we design a clinical trial and we have a conversation with those regulatory agencies, and we design the trial to meet those regulatory endpoints because that's really important. Otherwise, your drug doesn't get approved. But we don't necessarily design our trials with the payers in mind, because what the payers value is often different from what the regulators value. So a regulator might say, well, as long as you achieve 3 points reduction on some score, that will mean that we can approve this medicine, or a 50% reduction on some sort of disease score. But a payer will turn around and say, well, what is the impact of that disease score on the patient and on the patient outcomes? So actually what I want to see is, how does that disease score translate into a reduction in mortality or a reduction in morbidity? So actually thinking that stuff through really early on means that you can design your trial better so that you can guarantee access, or certainly increase the likelihood of access when you eventually do come to market. And that's really important, because it's all very well getting it through the regulators, but if it then hits the market and there's no one, and no one's going to approve it, well, then you're in real trouble.
That obviously impacts on the deal value, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think back to doing that, so that's the development pathway. And if you've got an astute investor or an astute large pharmaceutical company, they're the ones who get burned by this, right? They're the people who bring a drug to market. So actually, I read this stat that something like 50% of the drugs that failed to meet market expectations when they got to the market did so because of poor market access. So it's the drug companies getting burned by this, not the little developer. So they want to make sure that whatever the developer is developing will meet those market access endpoints. Now, you know, a lot of small developers say, well, that's their problem. Let them worry about that. Well, that is true to some extent. It is their problem, but they're going to pass that problem on to the small developer, and they're going to want to know, you know, how much of that thinking and work have they already done.
Is market access only relevant at the stage 3 of a launch, would you say, of a drug?
No, so that I think is when a lot of people pick up market access and go, oh, we haven't really done anything about this. We need to think about this. But in some ways, at that point, the deal is done. It's too late, because you've developed your trial, you've run your trial. Whether the trial is over or not, you can't change it. You know, the protocol is locked. You started dosing patients. So whatever outcomes you're going to get and whatever comparator you've chosen for that trial is what you've got. So you then find yourself backpedaling and saying, well, okay, so I've got these kind of outcomes, and you go and speak to payers and you say, are these outcomes relevant? And the payers say no. Well, then you have to do some real world. You have to develop some real world data to try and overcome that. You have to come up with some kind of post hoc rationalization for why that trial is appropriate to a payer. If, on the other hand, you've thought about it from phase, even preclinical in some cases, and I do get some clients coming to me preclinical, and I'm really glad when they do, because you don't necessarily need to do the full workup, but it's so helpful at that point to have thought about it and to design your TPP, so your target product profile, to design your trial to fit what you know will eventually be a challenge. So no, phase 3 is too late. I think at least phase 2, you need to be doing it, and potentially earlier.
During the partnering and licensing process, who should undertake pricing, evaluation, and market access?
That's a really good question, Steve. So often the argument I hear is, I don't need to do this because the big pharma people are going to do it during diligence. And I think that, that there is certain truth to that, in that a big pharma will or should do it as part of their diligence. But I think there's two elements to this. One is sometimes they don't, and sometimes they just rely on kind of internal knowledge. And sometimes you will enter a negotiation and you both want to understand what the price is, and because it's a key element in the negotiation. And it can really affect the value of the deal overall. So if they think the price is one thing and you think the price is likely to be another thing, and they're two very, very different numbers, well, it's helpful for you to have something to base your number on. So doing your own research is really important.
What kinds of changes have you seen in pricing and market access strategy at the deal stage? Have you seen any changes in the approach towards market access and pricing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think recently, and we've seen a big change in the value or the importance that pricing has on deals when it comes to thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly in the USA. So I frequently have conversations with big pharma, market access, BD people. And one of them the other day was saying that they will now only look at drugs that are going to reach peak sales after a much more truncated period because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the impact that that might have on pricing. Now, if you have a drug that you think is going to be a big blockbuster, then it's probably going to be affected by the Inflation Reduction Act. So that is going to impact your valuation in a big way. So getting the right level of insight about whether that's going to happen or not, I think is really important. So that's a really key element. And it's not just the US either. So you look at Germany, for example, recent changes in the German system around orphan disease, around how they're assessing medicines. And Germany is the biggest market in Europe. So again, that has a big impact on the European part of deals. And there are other changes going on in Italy and so on. And all of these things, do play a role much earlier than you think. So you think, well, this is a problem. And you asked the question earlier, Steve, about phase 3. You think that this is a problem when it comes to registration in phase 3. But having a solution to those problems, because they don't need to be problems. That's the thing. If you've preempted it, and around the deal and in the early stages of development, then it helps you when you come to phase 3 or when your partner comes to phase 3 it helps them to get the drug over the line and into the market.
Do you think this is part of the lower risk attitude that's being adopted by pharmaceutical companies currently?
So yeah, in the deal space, we're seeing a lot of appetite for de-risked development. So targets that have worked before, by that I mean drug targets that have worked before. There's a lot of kind of 505(b)(2) development, and again, so I'll decode that by which I mean reformulated assets or kind of assets that are, say some old drug that's been kind of updated to make it work in some different way. Doesn't require the same level of investment in terms of phase 3s and all that. It can kind of go through a much more truncated pathway. So that's one element. But then on the other element, we are, I guess, seeing the growth of things like gene therapies and CAR Ts and so on. So there is still kind of an appetite for more risky and more innovative medicines. But that also comes with its challenges. In Germany, we've seen several kind of immunotherapies thrown out recently, and Bluebird Bio leaving the European space altogether, saying that it's not gonna work. So, and all of that is related to pricing. It's not about clinical development. It's not about potential uptake. It's pricing, fundamentally. So, did Bluebird Bio do their work early on, very, very early on? Maybe, probably. Did they design their trials right? I don't know. So I think there is or is it just payers being, excuse my French, bloody minded? I don't know. So I think it's a challenging world for pricing and access, and so just making sure that you've headed those problems off at the pass, I think is vital.
You mentioned VCs or venture capitalists earlier on in our conversation. Do you think pricing and market access is part of the process of the VC?
Good question. I mean, I've spoken to some VCs, and because they tend to be investing quite early, a lot of them will be investing in kind of Series A funding. So that's kind of discovery, quite early, kind of preclinical. And at that point, you're just trying to get the basic science right. Could this do anything, at all? So at that point, I think if they are thinking about pricing, they're thinking about it in a very, very general way. They're maybe looking at analogs. So they're saying, well, this is a drug in, I don't know, heart disease. Other heart disease drugs get this type of price. So yeah, there is potential for pricing there. So I think that's probably the extent of it. I think if they're investing in slightly later stage assets, so phase one assets, for example, and you do get some of that, in that situation, then if they're not, they should be. And more, I have conversations with VCs who, when they're investing in the kind of later stage, they do have expertise who kind of consult on things like this. But whether they're doing full workups, payer research, et cetera, then probably not going that far.
From their point of view, wouldn't a comparable be enough?
Yeah, I think they often see it that way from the VC point of view, because and again, it depends on the ticket size of the investment. If they're going to invest $1 million in a company, then it's probably not really worth them spending whatever it is on the. It's not in their business model, right? They're sort of spray and pray kind of approach. You don't really need to be doing full diligence workups. But if they're making a more significant investment, then I think it's particularly when it's in a slightly later stage. And when I say later stage, I'm still talking about early clinical stage development. Then in that situation, yes, they probably will start to look at that, or they will be telling the investment company that they need to see that work. And that kind of reminds me of the point I was trying to make, the point earlier around deal making with big pharma. So a big pharma company is more likely to look at a small biotech who has done the work to demonstrate that they are going to be commercially successful. So I used to work for Mundi Pharma and Pfizer, and I spent a lot of time assessing incoming BD opportunities. And companies that had done, one of the questions I would always ask is, have you done any payer research? And a company that would turn around and say, well, no, but we've looked at some comparables in the area, and we think that we can get the same as the highest priced drug at a list price in the area. I look at that company, I immediately go, well, these guys haven't done any work, haven't done the right level of thinking. And whereas others who have done primary research, sometimes I would progress that asset without doing our own primary research. So actually we would just, if it was good enough research, I would just take what you've done, because I wouldn't necessarily do better research than that. If you've done a good piece of research, why repeat it? Why waste the money? Admittedly, maybe you were testing the wrong TPP, etc. So I think that's a really key point, and the other side of why it's really important to do the work. Because when a pharmaceutical company does a due diligence or a diligence on a new asset, they will do two stages of diligence. They'll do pre-diligence, whether to progress your asset through, and if you haven't done any work, they won't even do it. They won't look at it. They'll say, okay, we're just going to progress. I'm not going to progress your asset because you haven't done the work that's required. But if you have done the work, then you'll progress it to the next stage of diligence, and then you're really talking about a potential deal.
Thank you for that. I think it really boils down to, what are the essential things to do in the very early stages in pricing and market access?
Yeah, so so I think really important things are, one, to look at the market landscape, the pricing and access landscape, understand what previous decisions have been made in the area around your asset. That's number one. Number two is speak to some payers. You don't, again, depend if it's very, very early, it can be quite hypothetical conversations. They can be, what would happen if, what this happened or that happened. You can build scenarios, you can build various different target product profiles and test all kinds of different things and test outcomes. What kind of outcomes would you like to see? And then finally, it's modeling. There are various different methodologies that you can use to things like health economic modeling, but you kind of turn it on its head. So you sort of back into a price, for example. So there's various different methods that you can use. And I think those, those three methods and will triangulate for you a price and the kind of challenges you might be facing when you ultimately come to market.
Ralph, what is it your company can do for startups, for companies in early development?
So we can do all of those things. So our offering is focused around deal making and early development. So a lot of other market access consultancies focus on HTA, early engagement with payers, etc. And a lot of that is kind of slightly later stage. We like to focus on the deals and making sure that companies are set up for success when they come to actually do their submissions and so on. So we will do pricing and access market research for you, payer research. We will build your economic model. We will do your landscaping work, and that's the market access stuff. Alongside that, we can also do valuations, NPV valuations, discounted cash flow models, benchmarking, and so on. And the two really go hand in hand. And it's really important that when you're doing a valuation, that you think about pricing. And so doing the two together is a really great marriage of insights.
I actually know of some of your clients, and they speak extremely highly of your success and your great work. So I wanted to thank you very much today for your time. And I look forward to talking to you again in 6 months' time when we revise a couple of other subjects in market access and reimbursement.
Thank you so much, Steve.